story combines all sorts of random thoughts for me. So I'm inviting you into the random brain of Candace, which, good luck. We'll pray that everybody will come out safely. But so first of all, the expression itself, walks on water. I mean, that identifies a person, doesn't it, with extraordinary talents or abilities. We say that person walks on water, and an image comes up for almost every single one of us. So that's one thought. Next, there's this wonderful cartoon that shows two men on the shore watching Jesus walk across the water, and one says to the other, "You just have to know where the rocks are." So that's my other thought. Then I have this memory of a painting from my childhood Sunday school days that shows this very serene Jesus on a relatively calm sea, larger than life, feet just above the water, his white garments dry and blown slightly as if by a breeze. Anyone remember sort of a painting kind of like that anyway? So I have these images of art and humor that provide insight into maybe what's meaningful as well as what might be troubling about this text that we tend to call Jesus Walks on the Water. And then more recently, many of us in the church participated in the movie here with a study of the movie The Shack. And so there was another depiction of sort of a takeoff of how this scene might look today. So I invite us to watch together.
Mac, it's okay.
Why are you doing this to me?
This isn't me.
You told me to come out here.
Mac, this is happening inside you. You're letting it consume you, and you don't have to. Just take a deep breath and listen to my voice.
Don't look at it, Mac. Look here.
Don't think about the past. Don't think about the pain. Look at me. Everything is gonna be okay. Look at me. Trust me, none of this can hurt you. Just keep your eyes on me. Breathe. Good, Mac. I'm not going anywhere. Now, let's get you out of this boat.
What?
You heard me.
This is not funny.
I'm not joking. You can do this.
I can't.
Not on your own, you can't.
I was thinking.
No, Mac. You're imagining a future without me, and that future does not exist. I promise to go with you always, right? Right here. Come on. Here we go. Now what? Just start walking. Yeah, okay. How you doing?
I'm still freaking out.
Huh. Looks like we've got company. Look at this. Well, see? What a beauty. Must be over 2 feet long. We're trying to catch him for weeks.
Why'd you just command him by joke?
What's the fun in that?
Those who haven't seen the movie and you don't know the backstory, it's fairly obvious, but the sinking of the boat, the blackness of the water around him, the images of his children drowning and calling out to him, those are all indications of the storms and the angst and the pain in the main character's life. And frankly, he's having a really hard time seeing God in the midst of life's storms. So letting that voice of Jesus get through to him, hearing him speak and being willing to listen to him at all are huge milestones for him. And then actually getting out of the boat and walking with Jesus, those are huge leaps of faith for Mac, who's the character in the story. Just as I am guessing they would be for most of us if we found ourselves in that same situation. Why is it that most often it's the most challenging times in our lives that we tend to sense God's presence most clearly? I mean, certainly there aren't any of us here who would say that God only appears when we most need God or when we feel like we're sinking in the mire of life. But there certainly is something about significant challenges and trials that tend to clarify our priorities and cut through the many distractions of everyday life so that we tend to see God most clearly in those troubling times in our lives. And that's really part of what's going on in today's gospel reading. After feeding the thousands who followed him into the wilderness, Jesus actually commands the disciples to head across the sea without him while he remains on shore to send the crowds away and then spend some time in communion with his Father on the mountain. I mean, evidently, even Jesus needs a break every now and then. And while the disciples are crossing, a storm arises that threatens to engulf them. And then we read in the early hours of the morning, that's quite a bit later, isn't it? Jesus strides across the water to meet them. And that's where in the story we find Peter and the disciples engaging with Jesus. But let's go back for a moment because the 12 disciples have apparently spent the whole night struggling to get across that blasted lake before Jesus shows up near daybreak. Now, this is not a massive body of water. We know that the farthest point from east to west is no more than 7 miles. Yet, even rowing, they haven't been able to traverse it because there's this storm that has battered or actually thrashed their boat. Now, we aren't ancient people, so we don't quite understand the fear of the sea that was prevalent in the ancient world. For them, storms always represented chaos and danger. So when we hear metaphors of storms or we see storms coming, we're actually talking about what people in that day would have perceived as demons at work upon the face of the water. So this isn't just a storm. This is a storm. The demonic powers seem to be winning. Remember, he sends them away during the day, and it's not until daybreak that they see him walking on the water. And then when they see Jesus, who do they think he is? A ghost. And it's terror all around, and you can see from that worldview why when they saw Jesus, they began to scream, the scriptures tell us. So this isn't a tame little story. This is a pretty awesome sort of nightmare kind of a story, something that some of you who like horror films might actually put on the big screen. And so fear erupts from the disciples because they are anticipating how this story will probably end. All night long, they have been threatened by the prospect that this might be their last moment on earth. Their Savior is on the shore, back where they left him. The boat is being battered. It doesn't seem like there is any hope. There is water that seems to be leaping from its depths to swallow the boat. And then they see this specter appearing on the horizon, coming probably from the realm of the dead to capture its newest victims. And the disciples, we might see, are left to die at the mercy of the worldly powerful forces that are out there. And so it's no question that they mistake Jesus for a wave-walking specter. And the disciples grow even more alarmed as he draws near. And so what are Jesus' first words to them? Do not be afraid. He reassures them that it is he, it's me. Or in some translations, I am. They don't need to be afraid. God's presence is with them. He is not a ghost. And we read that fairly quickly his encouragement works, and then some, as Peter is then emboldened to ask if he might join Jesus out on the water. And at first confident, given Jesus' assent, Peter soon remembers the height of the waves and the depth of the sea and the terror of the night, and he loses heart, whereupon Jesus reaches out and grabs him. When Jesus makes this comment about his lack of faith, it's as if a light bulb goes on in the mind of the disciples for the first time, and they confess at that moment, truly, you must be God's Son. Which is sort of interesting if you think about it, because Jesus had just fed over 5,000 people, helpless, vulnerable, hungry people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, which revealed both divine power and divine compassion. And yet it's here, at this moment of extremity, when their fear is at astronomical heights, that the disciples perceive most clearly who Jesus is. And Jesus identifies himself by telling the disciples to take heart, it's me, something that he has said before. And then he declares those words, I am, which would have divine overtones, which would lead them maybe to saying truly, this, you must be God's Son. And he says, don't be afraid, which is something he says often in the Gospel of Matthew. So I'm thinking you've got all this wonderful stuff sort of coming up. And so as sort of an aside, when Peter says, if it is you, if it is you, he's actually speaking the words that later Satan speaks, the high priest speaks, the mockers at the cross, who all say, if it is truly you. And we're going to discover next week that Peter does it again, so he's sort of a slow learner. But in each case, like Peter, they want Jesus to do something in order to verify his identity. Peter doesn't just say, "Hey, Jesus, call me out of the boat." He says, if it's you, order me to come onto the water. Friends, that's not really a good thing, but it really is very, very human, which is why Peter is such a wonderful metaphor for every single one of us. And unlike those other times with all of those other people, for some reason, Jesus grants this request to Peter. But it shouldn't be any surprise to us that matters are not going to end well for him. So then it got me thinking, do you think Matthew is intending his reader to realize that no disciple is totally worthless because they can always serve as a bad example? I don't think that's quite Matthew's intent, but I do think that it says a couple of things to us. First, that really we're not intended to walk on water, and that if we try, we'll probably find ourselves deep over our heads and unable to save ourselves. And second, that Peter needs to know what we all need to know when we're caught in situations where we find ourselves sinking like a rock. And that's that we just need to call out, "Lord, rescue me." So part of what really strikes me in this passage is how it reveals something deeply true about humanity. And I have a hunch that we're right in there with the disciples about this kind of clarity. Because how many of you, like me, are often overlooking God's presence in the pleasant and peaceful portions of your life, and yet calling out in frantic worry when things take a difficult turn? Or in subtle ways, how often do you preface your relationship with God with the words, "if it is you"? Now, I'm not totally sure why this is, but I think that part of it is that we spend a fair amount of our time and energy trying to establish a stable and safe and secure life, both for us and for those we love. And there's nothing wrong with that on one level, because from the beginning, God desires that we flourish, and we all know that stability also promotes growth. But all too often, we get caught up in our modest successes, and then we get in this place where we assume that we really don't need God all that much, or at least we forget how much a part of our lives God is and God wants to be. Or perhaps we even confuse safety and stability with the abundant life. Either way, there are times in our lives when we forget how much we need to depend on God, until tragedy strikes in the form of illness or job loss or end of relationship or some sort of grave mistake that we've made, and suddenly we're reminded of our ongoing need for God. Now, sometimes that leads us closer to God. Sometimes, like with Mac in the movie The Shack, we actually turn our backs on God. We maybe even go through the motions, still attending church, professing to believe, but doubt and skepticism take hold in our hearts, and the "if it is you" becomes very, very real. But this story doesn't only tell us about ourselves and our human tendencies, it also tells us a lot about God. First, no matter what it is that reminds us of our need for God, God is always ready to respond. Just as Jesus reassures the disciple and reaches out to grab hold of Peter, no matter what his motive might have been or how he asked the question, no matter what ifs he had, so God also responds to us with compassion and support, whether we deserve it or not, whether we seek it or not. Second, and I'd argue even more importantly, God not only responds to our need, but God actually desires that we seek to live lives of abundance and courage. If we remember, Jesus actually commanded the disciples to cross the sea, to go on ahead of him, trusting that they would be able to navigate both the sea and the storm and to overcome their fears. And I still think that that is God's desire for us. God desires, that is, that we trust that God is with us and for us, and thereby we can live our lives with courage and hope, taking chances, risking ourselves in relationship, seeking the welfare of individuals and community all around us, all the while that even when we overlook God's presence, God is always there. Sometimes to encourage us to overcome our fears, sometimes sending us out ahead, sometimes reaching out to grab us in forgiveness, in comfort, mercy, grace, but always willing and always with a hand out in love. So go ahead, like Peter, just take God's outstretched hand and walk with Jesus wherever he leads, even if it's right in the midst of a storm. Amen.